South Park has been on the air for over 28 seasons. 28 seasons of 4 boys in a small Colorado town saying and doing things that would get any real human being fired, arrested, or both. And in that time, Trey Parker and Matt Stone have offended pretty much every group of people on the planet. Christians, Muslims, Scientologists, Republicans, Democrats, celebrities, activists, entire nations. Nobody is safe. But there's one area where they've pushed harder, gone further, and sparked more controversy than almost anywhere else. Race. Think about it. Randy Marsh standing on the Wheel of Fortune set, staring at a puzzle that reads in blank jeers with 5 seconds on the clock and the category people who annoy you. And he says it on national television. Or Cartman dressed in a full Nazi uniform, practicing German speeches in his bedroom mirror, rallying the entire town of South Park into goose-stepping down Main Street while shouting anti-Semitic slogans they think are Aramaic. Or the entire town burning a lowercase t on a wealthy black family's lawn because it stands for time to leave. And they're all wearing white sheets, but they're ghosts, supposedly. And that's nothing compared to what else is in here. Because tonight, we're going through all of it. Every episode, every controversy, every moment where South Park looked at race in America and said something that no other show on television would dare to say. Let's start with one of the earliest and smartest episodes they ever made about race. Season 4, Episode 7, Chef Goes Nanners. The episode opens in the mayor's office. Jimbo and Chef are arguing. Jimbo wants to keep the flag. It's been around since the town was founded. Chef says it's racist. And when the mayor unfurls the flag and asks what's wrong with it, we finally see it for the first time. And what's on it is genuinely shocking. But now, let's slow things down, settle in, and get comfortable. Because we're going to go through every one of these episodes properly. The context, the comedy, the controversy, and why South Park keeps getting away with it. So if you're watching this late at night, grab your blanket, get cozy, and let's begin. And before we go any further, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's get into it. I want to start at the beginning, or at least near the beginning, because South Park has been dealing with race almost from its very first episodes. But there's one early episode that set the template for everything that came after. One that showed Parker and Stone could do more than just shock. They could think. So, Chef Goes Nanners. This episode aired on July 5th, 2000, right in the middle of a very real national conversation about the Confederate flag. At that time, South Carolina was in the middle of a heated debate about whether to remove the Confederate flag from its state house. People were genuinely divided. On one side, there were those who said the flag represented heritage and history. On the other, people who pointed out that the flag was a symbol of slavery, segregation, and racial violence. And nobody could agree. Now, in a world of nuanced think pieces and carefully worded op-eds, most shows would approach a topic like this with great seriousness. A prestige HBO drama might devote an entire season to it. A Netflix documentary might interview scholars and activists. But Trey Parker and Matt Stone looked at that debate and decided to do what they always do. They made it absurd. Instead of a Confederate flag, the South Park town flag shows something you can't possibly defend on historical grounds. A lynching. 4 white figures hanging a black figure. There's no ambiguity here. It's not abstract. It's not subtle. It's a picture of racial violence, and it's been flying over the town for generations. Chef sees the flag and immediately protests. He's outraged, and rightfully so. He goes to the mayor's office and demands that the flag be changed. It's racist, he says. It's offensive. It has no place in a modern town. And the audience is with him. Of course the flag should be changed. Look at it. But then the other side speaks up. Jimbo, Stan's uncle, is the most vocal defender of the flag. And his argument sounds familiar. He says the flag has been the South Park flag since his great-grandfather helped found the town. It's part of their heritage. It's part of who they are. He's not defending the racism, he insists. He's defending the history. And here's where the genius of the episode starts to reveal itself. Because Jimbo genuinely believes he's not being racist. He looks at that flag and sees tradition. He sees his family's legacy. He doesn't see what Chef sees, and the episode forces you to sit with that disconnect. How can two people look at the exact same image and see completely different things? The mayor, overwhelmed by the controversy, decides to punt the issue to the one group of people she thinks can handle it objectively: the third grade class. She assigns the kids a formal debate. One team will argue for keeping the flag, the other will argue for changing it. Stan, Kyle, and Kenny end up on the pro-flag side. Wendy, Cartman, Bebe, Clyde, and Butters take the anti-flag position. Now, here's where a subplot develops that adds another layer. Wendy starts developing an inexplicable crush on Cartman. This is mostly played for comedy, but it serves a purpose too. It distracts from the main issue. It pulls focus. And that's kind of the point. When you're caught up in personal drama, the bigger issues around you don't get addressed. But the real brilliance of this episode comes from the KKK. Members of the Ku Klux Klan show up at City Hall to voice their support for keeping the flag. And they're not subtle about it. They explicitly call it a symbol of white power. This creates a massive problem for Jimbo and the other heritage defenders. They don't want to be on the same side as the Klan. They're not racists. They just like their flag. But now, the KKK is standing right next to them, saying the quiet part loud. So Jimbo comes up with a plan. He and his friend Ned infiltrate the KKK and convince them to switch sides. The logic is twisted, but brilliant. If the KKK publicly supports changing the flag, then the townspeople will automatically vote to keep it, because nobody wants to agree with the Klan on anything. The KKK leader actually goes along with this, and the Klan switches its position. Think about what Parker and Stone are saying here. They're showing how political positions become less about the actual issue and more about who's associated with which side. People don't vote based on the merits of the argument. They vote based on who else is making that argument. If the Klan supports it, it must be bad. If the Klan opposes it, it must be good. The substance of the debate becomes irrelevant. But the real twist, the one that makes this episode genuinely special, comes during the debate itself. The kids present their arguments, and Chef watches from the audience. And as the pro-flag team lays out their case, something clicks for Chef. He realizes something that changes the entire meaning of the episode. The kids don't see the flag the way the adults do. Stan, Kyle, and Kenny were never defending a racist image. They didn't even register that the stick figures on the flag were different colors. When they looked at the flag, all they saw were 5 people and a hanging. They were debating whether the flag should depict violence, not whether it should depict racism. They were arguing about capital punishment, not racial oppression. Chef says something along the lines of, all this time he thought the kids had turned racist, when actually they were so not racist that they didn't even see the separation of black and white. All they saw were 5 people. And that's the moment that elevates this episode from a good satire to something genuinely thought-provoking. The children's innocence becomes a mirror for the adults' assumptions. Chef assumed the kids were racist because they were defending the flag, but the kids couldn't see race in the image at all. They were colorblind in the most literal sense. And while the episode doesn't pretend that colorblindness solves racism, it does force you to consider how much of the problem is about perception. How much of racism is about what we project onto things rather than what's actually there. The episode ends with a compromise. The flag is redesigned. The hanging stays, but now the figures around the gallows are different colors, including another black figure. It's equal opportunity execution. The violence remains, but the racial specificity is removed. It's dark. It's absurd. And it's exactly the kind of non-solution that real-world debates about symbols tend to produce. Now, it's worth noting that Matt Stone and Trey Parker themselves were somewhat critical of this episode. Stone called it kind of half-baked, admitting they wanted to leave the office early when they wrote it. They felt the core problem was that the flag's imagery was so blatantly racist that it was impossible for viewers to find the pro-flag position reasonable. The satire collapsed because nobody watching could genuinely defend a picture of a lynching as heritage. But I think that's actually what makes the episode work, because in the real world, the Confederate flag debate had the same problem. The people defending the flag genuinely believed they weren't being racist, and the people opposing it genuinely couldn't understand how anyone could look at that symbol and not see racism. The episode captures that impasse perfectly, even if Parker and Stone didn't think it was their best work. And there's something else worth sitting with here. That final shot of the redesigned flag. The one where the hanging is still there, but now the crowd around the gallows is multiracial. That image is South Park at its most cynical and most honest. Because that's what real-world compromises on racial symbols often look like. You don't actually fix the underlying problem. You just diversify the window dressing. The violence remains. The power dynamics remain. But now there are more colors involved, so everyone can pretend that progress has been made. It's uncomfortable because it's true. And it's the kind of truth that sits with you long after the episode ends. You know, the more I think about this episode, the more I think its real genius isn't in the flag debate at all. It's in the kids. Because the kids represent something that adults have lost. Not innocence, exactly, but a kind of clarity. The ability to look at something and see what's actually there, rather than what their experiences and assumptions tell them to see. The adults are all trapped in their own frameworks. Chef sees racism. Jimbo sees heritage. The KKK sees white power. But the kids just see people. And the episode asks whether that simplicity is naive, or whether it's the closest any of them come to actual wisdom. It's a question without an answer. And that's what makes it a perfect episode to start with. Because everything we're going to talk about tonight exists in that space between those two possibilities. Between the innocence of not seeing race and the responsibility of refusing to look away from it. Now, let's move on to an episode that many people consider the single most important thing South Park has ever done about race. Season 11, Episode 1. With apologies to Jesse Jackson. This one aired on March 7th, 2007, and it was directly inspired by a real event that had happened just a few months earlier. In November 2006, comedian Michael Richards, who most people knew as Kramer from Seinfeld, had one of the most infamous meltdowns in the history of stand-up comedy. During a set at the Laugh Factory in Los Angeles, heckled by audience members, Richards snapped. He didn't just snap a little, he screamed the N-word repeatedly at black audience members. He referenced lynching. The entire tirade was captured on a cell phone camera and uploaded to the internet, where it spread faster than anything Richards had ever done on Seinfeld. His career was effectively over within days. In the aftermath, Richards appeared on various talk shows to apologize, visibly shaken and tearful, and notably, he sought out Jesse Jackson to express his remorse. The implication was that by apologizing to Jesse Jackson, the most prominent civil rights figure in America, Richards had apologized to Black America as a whole. Parker and Stone watched this entire media cycle unfold and asked a simple question, one that most people were thinking, but nobody in the mainstream media seemed willing to articulate. Why Jesse Jackson? Who decided that apologizing to one man was the same as apologizing to an entire race? Who made Jesse Jackson the designated recipient of white guilt? And what does it say about how America thinks about race that this is considered the appropriate protocol? The episode opens with one of the most audacious scenes South Park has ever produced. Randy Marsh is on Wheel of Fortune. He's made it to the bonus round. The category is People Who Annoy You. The letters on the board spell out N, blank, G, G, E, R, S. Randy has 5 seconds. The clock is ticking. And he says it. He says the word. On live national television. in front of his family, in front of millions of viewers. The correct answer, of course, was naggers. People who nag. It's a puzzle about annoying people, and the word is naggers. But Randy went somewhere else entirely. And in that moment, Parker and Stone crystallized something that's almost impossible to capture in any other medium: the gap between intent and impact. Randy wasn't trying to say something racist. He was trying to win a game show. He was under pressure. The clock was ticking. And the word that his brain produced in that moment of panic reveals something about the architecture of American consciousness. The word is in there. It's in the mental file cabinet, right next to the correct answer, separated by a single letter. And under pressure, the wrong file came out. In their DVD commentary, Parker and Stone called this one of their favorite things they'd ever done on the show, and you can see why. The setup is mechanically perfect. Every element, the category, the letters, the timer, the audience, converges to create a moment of maximum discomfort with maximum plausibility. Randy isn't a racist. He's a regular guy who made a terrible mistake on live television. And the episode uses that mistake to explore what happens after. The fallout is immediate. Randy becomes a pariah. He's the N-word guy. That's his identity now. Everything else about him, his career, his family, his personality, is erased. He's reduced to the worst thing he's ever done. And that reduction, that inability of the public to see a person beyond their worst moment, is another layer of the episode's critique. Cancel culture before the term existed. His family is mortified. The town is outraged. And Randy, desperate for absolution, does exactly what Michael Richards did. He goes to Jesse Jackson. The scene at Jesse Jackson's office is deliberately humiliating. Jackson bends over his desk and tells Randy to apologize by kissing his backside. Randy complies. A photograph is taken. The image circulates through the media. And Randy believes, sincerely believes, that this has fixed everything. He apologized to the right person. He followed the protocol. The box has been checked. Meanwhile, at school, Stan approaches his friend, Token Black, fully expecting the situation to be resolved. His dad apologized. Jesse Jackson accepted. Everything should be fine now. But Token isn't fine. Token is angry. And when Stan tries to explain that his dad isn't really racist, that he just made a mistake, Token pushes back. Stan says something like, "Listen, my dad isn't racist. He's just stupid. It's no big deal." And Token responds firmly, "Actually, it is kind of a big deal. You don't know how it feels when that word comes out." And then comes the line that defines the entire episode. Stan, confused, says that his dad already apologized to Jesse Jackson. And Token fires back. Jesse Jackson is not the emperor of black people. To which Stan innocently replies, "He told my dad he was." That exchange is one of the most important moments in the entire history of South Park. It exposes so many layers of the race conversation in America. The assumption that there's a chain of command. That if you apologize to the right authority figure, it trickles down to everyone else. The idea that one public figure can speak for an entire race. The fact that Stan genuinely doesn't understand why Token is still upset. He's not being malicious. He's not being dismissive on purpose. He literally does not have the framework to understand what Token is experiencing. Staff writer Vernon Chapman, who is half black, was a driving force behind this episode. He was particularly outraged by Michael Richards' real-world apology to Jesse Jackson, and his frustration became the beating heart of the script. The line about Jesse Jackson not being the emperor of black people came directly from Chapman's own feelings about how the Richards situation was handled. There's a parallel subplot in the episode that reinforces the theme. A motivational speaker named Dr. David Nelson, who is a person of short stature, comes to South Park Elementary to give a sensitivity seminar. Cartman immediately begins laughing at him and refuses to stop. Dr. Nelson tries every approach. He tries patience. He tries education. He tries confrontation. He calls Cartman fatso to give him a taste of his own medicine. Nothing works. Cartman physically overpowers him. The lesson fails completely. This subplot mirrors the main story perfectly. All the institutional responses to prejudice fail. Randy's public apology fails. Jesse Jackson's authority fails. Sensitivity training fails. Confrontation fails. The episode systematically dismantles every tool society uses to address bigotry and shows that none of them actually work. They're all performative. They make the person apologizing feel better without addressing the harm experienced by the person on the receiving end. And here's what's remarkable. The NAACP praised this episode. They called it a good example of educating the public on the power of hate words and their impact on individuals. The episode uses the N-word over 40 times in 22 minutes, and the NAACP said it was educational. That's not something that happens by accident. It happens because the episode earns it. It earns the right to use that language by doing something meaningful with it. IGN gave the episode a perfect 10 out of 10. The AV Club praised it as borderline revolutionary, and the Parents Television Council, predictably, condemned it. But what's telling is how little mainstream media controversy the episode actually generated. Despite the language, despite the subject matter, most people recognized what the episode was doing. It wasn't celebrating racism. It was dissecting the inadequacy of how America deals with it. And maybe the most lasting thing about this episode is what it says about understanding. Near the end, Stan is still trying to get through to Token. He's still trying to say the right thing, do the right thing, make it better. And finally, he says something like, "Token, I get it now. I don't get it. I'll never get it." And for the first time in the episode, Token smiles. Because that's the answer. That's the only honest thing a white person can say about the black experience in America. I don't understand it. I can't understand it. And acknowledging that gap, that fundamental inability to cross over into someone else's lived experience, is the closest thing to empathy that honesty allows. That's a remarkable thing for a cartoon to articulate. And it's the reason this episode endures. Not because of the Wheel of Fortune scene, as iconic as it is. Not because of the 43 uses of the N-word, but because of that quiet moment at the end where a 10-year-old boy admits that understanding has limits, and that the admission itself is a form of respect. Think about that for a second. In a 22-minute animated comedy that opens with a game show gag and features a subplot about a man of short stature getting beaten up by a fourth grader, Parker and Stone managed to articulate something that most serious dramas about race never get close to. The gap between experience and empathy. The impossibility of fully knowing what someone else carries. And the grace that comes from admitting you can't. It's heavy stuff for a show about paper cutout characters, but that's what makes South Park what it is. Let's move forward to something very different in tone. Season 12, Episode 8. The China Problem. This one aired on October 8th, 2008, about 2 months after the Beijing Olympics, and it tackles a completely different kind of racial anxiety. The episode opens with Cartman watching the 2008 Summer Olympics opening ceremony on television. And if you remember that ceremony, you understand why it's a perfect starting point for this episode. Directed by Zhang Yimou, the Beijing ceremony featured 15,000 performers in flawless synchronization, unprecedented technological spectacle, and a display of national power that genuinely stunned the world. Steven Spielberg called it an unforgettable spectacle. Roger Ebert compared it to Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. 34 million Americans watched it, more than any non-American opening ceremony in history. Cartman watches this spectacle and becomes terrified. Not impressed. Not amazed. Terrified. He has a nightmare about Chinese soldiers invading America. He wakes up in a panic and becomes convinced that China is going to conquer the United States within days. He references their population of 2 billion, their technological advancement, their obvious organizational superiority, and nobody else takes him seriously. Stan, Kyle, and Kenny dismiss him as paranoid and delusional, but Cartman finds an ally in Butters. Because Cartman always finds an ally in Butters. It's one of the show's most reliable and darkest dynamics. Cartman is the manipulator. Butters is the mark. And the mechanism of manipulation is always fear. In this case, Cartman tells Butters that the Chinese are coming to kill his parents specifically. He names them. Stephen and Linda. Your parents, Butters. They're going to die. And Butters, who trusts Cartman despite everything, who has deep anxiety about his parents' safety, rooted in years of their own abusive behavior toward him, immediately signs up. No questions asked. Fear overrides reason, just like it always does. The two form the American Liberation Front and set about gathering intelligence on the coming invasion. Their intelligence gathering method involves dressing up in the most offensive, stereotypical Chinese costumes imaginable. Fake buck teeth, bamboo hats, pigtails. They walk into a P.F. Chang's China bistro speaking in exaggerated accents, replacing every L and R sound. Harrow, Pries, Risten. They attempt to interrogate the patrons about invasion plans. When the staff asks them to leave, Cartman escalates the situation by taking the entire restaurant hostage. He gives Butters a gun. Someone tries to escape. Butters shoots them. Now, on one level, this episode is doing what South Park always does. It's using Cartman as a vehicle for the most extreme and irrational version of a real cultural anxiety. The Beijing Olympics genuinely did make some Americans nervous. There was real unease about China's rising economic and military power. There were real conversations about whether America was losing its global dominance. Parker and Stone took that anxiety and amplified it to absurdity through the most xenophobic character on the show. But the episode has a problem, and it's a problem that a lot of South Park episodes share when they deal with Asian stereotypes. The satire relies on the audience recognizing that Cartman is an idiot. The fake buck teeth are funny because they're so obviously ridiculous. The accents are funny because they're so exaggerated. But the jokes themselves still come from the stereotypes. The humor doesn't come from deconstructing the stereotypes. It comes from performing them. And there's a real question about whether that's satire or just racist comedy with a thin layer of ironic distance. The episode was a massive rating success. 3.7 million viewers tuned in, making it the highest rated fall premiere in 9 years. IGN gave it a 9 out of 10. But other critics were less enthusiastic. One reviewer said it relied on cheap laughs at best. The Parents Television Council named it the worst cable content of the week, though that was mostly about the Indiana Jones subplot. The Indiana Jones subplot, by the way, is the episode's other major storyline. Kyle is traumatized after watching Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and he tearfully goes to the district attorney to press charges against Steven Spielberg and George Lucas for what they did to the franchise. The episode depicts graphic scenes of Spielberg and Lucas assaulting Indiana Jones, referencing films like The Accused and Deliverance. It's deliberately disturbing, and it's meant to express the intensity of fan betrayal through the most extreme metaphor possible. What's interesting about the Asian American response to this episode is that there wasn't really one, at least not an organized one. There were no major public statements from Asian American advocacy groups, no campaigns against it, no boycotts. This is in stark contrast to 2019, when the episode Banned in China prompted the Chinese government to literally ban South Park from the entire country. Parker and Stone responded with a mock apology that dripped with sarcasm, saying they loved money more than freedom and democracy. The China problem sits in an uncomfortable space. Its intent is clear. It's satirizing xenophobia and American racial paranoia. but its execution relies on the same stereotypes it claims to mock. And unlike with Apologies to Jesse Jackson, which gave Token genuine emotional weight and a clear voice, The China Problem gives no voice or dignity to its Chinese characters. They exist only as objects of Cartman's paranoia and the show's humor. And this is something worth pausing on, because it reveals one of the fundamental tensions in South Park's approach to racial satire. When the show gives a voice to the person being affected by racism, as it does with Token, the satire becomes something more than just provocation. It becomes empathetic. It becomes educational. But when the show removes that voice, when the people being stereotyped exist only as targets, the satire loses its moral center. It becomes a comedy of contempt rather than a comedy of understanding. The China Problem is South Park operating without that moral center. Cartman's paranoia is funny, yes. His disguise is ridiculous. The escalation to a hostage situation is absurd in the way South Park does best. But nobody in the episode pushes back on the stereotypes themselves. Nobody says, this is what it actually feels like to be Chinese in America when people treat you like a caricature. Without that counterbalance, the satire is incomplete, and the laughs that remain feel cheaper than they need to be. It's also worth considering the broader pattern. South Park's treatment of Asian characters and Asian culture has been more consistent in its reliance on accent humor and physical caricature than almost any other group. The City Walk owner with his exaggerated pronunciation, the buck teeth and bamboo hats, the conflation of different Asian cultures into a single monolithic stereotype. When you look at it across 28 seasons, there's a pattern that's harder to dismiss as ironic distance. But that's the conversation the show starts, whether it means to or not. And maybe that's enough. Maybe starting the conversation, even clumsily, even offensively, is better than the silence that most shows maintain. Or maybe it isn't. That's for you to decide. Now let's talk about an episode that handles Asian representation in a completely different way. Season 9, Episode 3, Wing. This one aired on March 23rd, 2005, and it's one of the most unusual South Park episodes ever made because it's based on a real person. The episode starts with the boys discovering that Token has won a singing contest at a local beauty pageant. Seeing a business opportunity, they establish the super awesome talent agency and sign Token as their first client. But the prestigious creative artists agency poaches Token almost immediately, leaving the boys without a performer. Enter Wing. She's the wife of Tuong Lu Kim, the City Walk restaurant owner, one of South Park's most controversial recurring characters, with his exaggerated accent and stereotypical mannerisms. Wing is a Chinese immigrant who was recently smuggled into the United States by the Chinese triads and owes them $10,000 for the passage. The boys take her on as their new client and enter her into a television competition called The Contender, which is a boxing show. Wing performs singing while being brutally beaten by a professional boxer. She sings Fernando by ABBA while getting pummeled. Sylvester Stallone watches from the audience and nods approvingly. The Chinese triads discover that Wing hasn't paid her debt and kidnap her. The boys mount a rescue mission, infiltrate the triad headquarters, and a shootout erupts. Kenny dies. The boys escape with Wing. And then Stan delivers a monologue that serves as the episode's moral center. He says that Wing is a person, not a commodity. She's not something to be bought and sold and exploited. And the episode draws a direct parallel between the boys' talent agency and the triad's human trafficking operation. Both businesses, it argues, exploit people's dreams for profit. But here's where this episode gets genuinely remarkable. Wing is based on a real person. Wing Han Song is a Hong Kong-born, New Zealand-based singer. Trey Parker and Matt Stone discovered her through a friend who showed them her website, and they were genuinely unsure whether her entire existence was, as Parker put it, a super sweet joke or a super sweet not joke. All of Wing's singing in the episode uses her actual recordings. Parker and Stone contacted her directly, got her approval to use her music, and create a cartoon version of her. And Wing's reaction to the episode was not what you might expect. She was grateful. Her album sales spiked after the episode aired. She gained an entirely new audience. She later wrote Parker and Stone a personal letter thanking them for the exposure. She never viewed the episode as mean-spirited. This complicates the conversation about South Park and racial stereotypes considerably. The person being satirized didn't feel mocked. She felt seen. She felt appreciated. And while that doesn't automatically mean the episode's use of Asian stereotypes is unproblematic, it does suggest that intent and outcome don't always line up the way we expect. The episode is asking a genuinely interesting question. What happens when satire and its subject find common ground? What happens when the person you're supposedly making fun of feels like you've done them a favor? And what does that say about the relationship between comedy, power, and representation? There's a philosophical concept here that's worth exploring. In ethics, there's a long-running debate between consequentialists, who judge an action by its outcomes, and deontologists, who judge an action by its inherent nature regardless of outcome. Most conversations about offensive comedy happen in the deontological framework. The comedy is offensive, therefore it's wrong, regardless of whether anyone was actually harmed. But Wing's response forces you into the consequentialist framework. The episode used Asian stereotypes, yes, but the outcome was a real Asian woman gaining a larger audience, selling more albums, and feeling genuinely grateful. If the person affected says the outcome was positive, can the comedy still be harmful? The answer probably is that both things are true simultaneously. The stereotypes in the episode can be problematic in a general sense, contributing to a broader cultural pattern of reducing Asian people to caricatures, while also being specifically positive for the one person they depicted. These two truths don't cancel each other out. They coexist, uncomfortably, the way so many things about race and comedy coexist. Wing Han Song eventually retired from music in 2015, after a long career that was undeniably boosted by her South Park appearance. She never wavered in her gratitude, and that fact sits at the center of this episode like a question mark that refuses to resolve into a period. Stan's monologue near the end of the episode deserves more attention too. When he says that Wing is a person, not a commodity, and draws the parallel between talent management and human trafficking, he's articulating something that goes far beyond Asian stereotypes. He's talking about the entire entertainment industry, the way it takes people's dreams and monetizes them, the way it strips away personhood and replaces it with market value. And while the episode wraps this up in comedy and absurdity, the underlying observation is sharp. The difference between a talent agent taking 10% and a criminal organization demanding a smuggling fee is smaller than anyone wants to admit. There's something philosophical in that gap, something worth sitting with as you think about how comedy interacts with identity and how the entertainment industry interacts with the people it claims to elevate. Let's move to something more pointed. Season 4, Episode 2. Cartman's Silly Hate Crime, 2000. This one aired on April 12th, 2000, and it tackles hate crime legislation head-on. The 2000 in the title is Trey Parker's parody of the Y2K trend, where everything from toasters to television shows was slapping the number onto its name for no good reason. The setup is deceptively simple, as is often the case with South Park's best episodes. The boys are preparing for a sled race against the girls, led by an arrogant kid named Lizzie. Before the race, Token makes some comments about Cartman's weight. Kyle joins in, calling Cartman a fat ass. Cartman, humiliated, threatens to throw a rock at Token, and then he actually does it. The rock hits Token in the face, giving him a black eye. Now here's the thing. Cartman's motivation had nothing to do with Token's race. He was angry about the weight comments. He would have thrown that rock at anyone who called him fat. But because Token is black and Cartman is white, the FBI arrives on scene and treats the incident as a federal hate crime. Cartman is arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced to juvenile prison until he turns 21. The episode's argument is straightforward, and it's a fundamentally libertarian one. All crimes involve some form of malice. If someone throws a rock at your face, the rock hurts the same, whether the person threw it because of your race or because you insulted their weight. The act is the same. The damage is the same. So why should the punishment be different based on the identity of the victim? The boys, who need Cartman's weight for the sled race, prepare a presentation for the governor of Colorado arguing exactly this. They call hate crime laws a savage hypocrisy. They say these laws give some victims more legal protection than others, based on who they are, which is itself a form of discrimination. The governor is persuaded and pardons Cartman. Meanwhile, in prison, Cartman meets his cellmate, a large man named Romper Stomper. Cartman discovers he can smuggle contraband by hiding items in his body, which earns him respect. When they attempt to escape together, Romper Stomper sacrifices his freedom so Cartman can get out. It's surprisingly emotional. And later, Cartman returns to the prison and, in a characteristically grotesque act of friendship, smuggles an entire Disneyland experience to Romper Stomper, who always dreamed of visiting. Cartman arrives just in time for the sled race, throws yellow buckets at the girls' sled to knock them off a cliff, and the boys win. It's chaos. It's absurd. And underneath all of it is a genuine philosophical argument about law and equality. Now, is the argument airtight? No. Critics have pointed out that the episode commits a false equivalency. Hate crimes aren't just about individual harm. When a crime is motivated by racial hatred, it sends a message of intimidation to the entire community. A black person who hears about a racially motivated assault is rationally more afraid than someone who hears about a random assault. The crime has a multiplier effect that extends far beyond the individual victim. Parker and Stone's argument focuses on the individual act and ignores the social dimension. But that doesn't mean the argument is worthless. The question of intent remains genuinely complicated. If Cartman's motive wasn't racial, should he be punished as though it were? How do you prove motive? What happens when authorities project motives onto defendants? These are real questions that the legal system still grapples with. And the episode, for all its absurdity, forces you to think about them. The episode holds an 8.6 rating on IMDb, which is quite high for early South Park. Collider called it a brilliant, contemplative gem. And whether you agree with its conclusions or not, it's an episode that treats its audience as intelligent enough to engage with a genuine philosophical debate wrapped inside a story about a fat kid throwing a rock. What I find most interesting about this episode, looking back at it from a distance of more than 2 decades, is how it anticipated the hate crime debate that would only intensify in the years to come. In 2009, the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act was signed into law, expanding federal hate crime protections. The debate Parker and Stone engaged with in 2000 was far from settled, and while the show's libertarian argument remains intellectually interesting, the real-world evidence has complicated it. Studies have shown that hate crimes do have a measurably different impact on communities than comparable, non-bias motivated crimes. The intimidation effect is real. The community-wide fear is real. But the episode's core insight, that the legal system struggles with questions of motive, that proving what someone was thinking when they committed an act is inherently uncertain, remains a genuine concern. Criminal law has always been uncomfortable with mind reading, and Cartman's Silly Hate Crime 2000, for all its absurdity, puts its finger on that discomfort with remarkable precision. There's also something quietly brilliant about the Romper Stomper subplot. By having Cartman form a genuine friendship with a convicted criminal, the episode humanizes both of them. It suggests that the categories we create, hate criminal, innocent child, dangerous offender, don't capture the full reality of who people are. Cartman is a terrible person in many ways, but he's also capable of loyalty and sacrifice. Romper Stomper is physically intimidating and presumably dangerous, but he's also gentle enough to dream of visiting Disneyland. The episode insists that people are more complicated than the labels we put on them. And while that insight applies specifically to hate crime legislation in this context, it resonates far more broadly with how we think about crime, punishment, and human nature. Now let's talk about one of the most layered episodes in the entire series. Season 5, Episode 12. Here Comes the Neighborhood. This one aired on November 28th, 2001. And on the surface, it looks like it's about class. But underneath, it's about something much more uncomfortable. Token Black, later revealed to be Tolkien Black, is the only black kid in South Park, and he's also the richest. His father is a successful lawyer. His mother is a chemist. They live in the nicest house in town. Despite his wealth, Token feels isolated. The other boys don't understand his interests. He doesn't fit in anywhere. So he comes up with a plan. He buys advertising space in Forbes magazine and promotes South Park as the next Aspen, positioning it as an exclusive, wealthy enclave. The plan works. Wealthy black celebrities begin moving to South Park. Will Smith, Jada Pinkett Smith, Snoop Dogg, Oprah Winfrey, P. Diddy, Kobe Bryant, Bill Cosby. The town transforms. Property values rise. New boutiques open. The atmosphere shifts entirely. But something unexpected happens. The rich new arrivals are far wealthier than Token. They play polo. They shop at exclusive stores. They speak with exaggerated English accents. They're as snobbish toward Token as the poorer kids were. Token's plan to find people like him fails because wealth doesn't create belonging. He's as much an outsider among rich black families as he was among poor white kids. Meanwhile, Mr. Garrison leads the working-class white residents in a campaign against the newcomers. But the language is carefully chosen. They call them richers, cash chuckers. The resentment is framed entirely in terms of class. They never say anything explicitly racial. They're not upset about the color of their neighbor's skin. They're upset about the size of their wallets. But then, the methods start to look very, very familiar. Garrison organizes an intimidation campaign. The townspeople dress in white sheets. They're ghosts, they say. They're just trying to scare the rich people away by haunting them. And they burn a lowercase t on a wealthy family's lawn. It stands for time to leave. The visual echoes are unmistakable. White robes, burning symbols, organized campaigns to drive out unwanted residents. The townspeople are performing the exact rituals of the Ku Klux Klan while insisting they have nothing to do with race. And the episode never breaks from this framework. The characters genuinely believe they're just upset about money. They can't see, or won't see, that they're reenacting a history of racial terrorism. Parker and Stone described this episode as depicting a world where racism doesn't exist. But, they added, the last word spoils it. That cryptic comment suggests the ending reveals what the rest of the episode tries to hide. The racism is there. It's always been there. It's just wearing a different costume. Token, rejected by both the poor white kids and the rich black families, ends up living with lions at the South Park Zoo. It's a devastating image. Complete alienation. Complete rejection. And it's played as a joke, which makes it even more unsettling. The kid who tried hardest to find where he belongs ends up with animals because no human community would have him. This episode works because it refuses to give you a clean answer. Is it about class or race? Yes. It's about both, and more importantly, it's about how class and race are intertwined in ways that people refuse to acknowledge. You can say it's about money. You can insist you don't see color. But when your methods of exclusion look exactly like historical racial violence, the denial stops being convincing. The real-world parallels to gentrification are inverted here. Usually, gentrification involves wealthier, often white people moving into working class, often black neighborhoods, and displacing residents through rising property values. This episode flips that dynamic. Wealthy black families move in, and the white working class residents respond with organized intimidation. The mechanism of exclusion is the same, only the direction has changed. And Token's fate is the episode's quiet tragedy. He goes to live with lions. Think about that image for a moment. A child, the only black child in town, tried everything to find a community where he belonged. He tried fitting in with the poor white kids. He tried importing rich black families. Neither worked. And his final refuge is with animals. It's played for laughs, like everything in South Park. But underneath the absurdity is a devastating portrait of what it feels like to not belong anywhere. To be too rich for the poor kids, and too poor for the rich kids. Too black for the white community, and too different for the black community. Token's isolation isn't about any single axis of identity. It's about the intersection of all of them. And the episode suggests, with a kind of bleak honesty, that for some people, there simply isn't a community that fits. That's a heavy thing for a cartoon to say, especially one that wraps it in jokes about ghost costumes and lowercase t burnings. But that tension between the comedy and the tragedy is what makes the episode linger. You laugh at the absurdity while simultaneously feeling the weight of Token's loneliness. And those two responses don't cancel each other out. They amplify each other. This is something South Park does at its best. It makes you laugh and think at the same time. And the thinking makes the laughter feel different. Not guilty, exactly, but aware. Aware that the thing you're laughing at is also the thing that hurts. And that awareness, uncomfortable as it is a kind of understanding. Let's move to an episode that deals with a different kind of prejudice, but one that's deeply connected to racial anxiety. Season 8, Episode 3, The Passion of the Jew. This one aired on March 31st, 2004. Just 5 weeks after Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ hit theaters and became one of the most controversial films of the decade. In reality, the controversy around Gibson's film was one of the most intense cultural battles of the early 2000s. Jewish scholars and the Anti-Defamation League identified anti-Semitic elements before the film even released, based on advanced screenings and script leaks. The most controversial element was a scene where the Jewish high priest Caiaphas declares, "His blood is on us and on our children," a line from the Gospel of Matthew that had been used for centuries to justify persecution of Jews. This blood libel, as it's known, was the theological backbone of medieval pogroms, the Inquisition, and ultimately contributed to the ideological framework that enabled the Holocaust. Including it in a major motion picture was, to Jewish communities, not a neutral storytelling choice. It was a deliberate invocation of the most dangerous anti-Semitic trope in Western history. Roger Ebert called the film the most violent he had ever seen. 7 major Hollywood studios, including all the traditional majors, refused to distribute it. Gibson financed the $30 million production himself and eventually found a small distributor in Newmarket Films. Despite all the controversy, or perhaps because of it, the film earned over $600 million worldwide, making it one of the highest-grossing R-rated films in history. South Park's response was characteristically immediate and unflinching. The episode follows 3 storylines that intersect around the film. Kyle sees the Passion of the Christ and has a genuine crisis of faith. He's Jewish, and the film's depiction of Jesus' crucifixion makes him feel overwhelming guilt about his religion's role in that event. He goes to Father Maxey at the local church seeking guidance. He even goes to his synagogue and proposes that Jewish people should formally apologize to Christians for crucifying Jesus, the same way the United States apologized for slavery. This causes uproar. Meanwhile, Cartman sees an entirely different opportunity. He watches the same film and sees it as ammunition for his pre-existing anti-Semitism. He starts a Mel Gibson fan club that's actually a thinly veiled neo-Nazi movement. He dresses in brown uniforms and practices German in the mirror. He practices saying, in German, "Kill the Jews. We cannot stand still until they are all dead." And then comes the most chilling scene in the episode. Cartman holds a rally outside the South Park Theater. He stands at a podium and delivers anti-Semitic slogans in German while handing out lines to the townspeople. And the townspeople, completely oblivious, repeat the German phrases enthusiastically. They think they're speaking Aramaic, the language of the film. They think they're celebrating the movie. They have no idea that they're goose-stepping through South Park chanting, "We must exterminate the Jews." They don't even know what they're saying. That scene is absolutely devastating as satire. It shows how easily people can be swept up into hateful movements without understanding what they're participating in. The townspeople aren't anti-Semites. They're not even particularly political. They're just excited about a popular movie. And Cartman exploits that excitement to advance an explicitly genocidal agenda. The gap between what the crowd thinks it's doing and what it's actually doing is terrifying. The third storyline follows Stan and Kenny, who think the film is terrible and just want their $18 back. They travel to Mel Gibson's Malibu mansion to demand a refund. Gibson is portrayed as completely unhinged. He's a sadomasochist who refuses to give them their money. When he chases them with a gun, they steal $18 from his wallet. But they realize they spent $87 on bus tickets, netting a loss of $69. Father Maxey provides the episode's voice of reason. He explains to Kyle that Gibson's film isn't biblically accurate. Medieval passion plays, which inspired the film, were explicitly designed to stir up anti-Semitism. The Bible itself has relatively few details about the crucifixion compared to Gibson's graphic emphasis. And Stan reinforces this point by arguing that Christianity should focus on Jesus' teachings rather than dwelling on his death. The Jewish Daily Forward called this episode perhaps the most biting critique of the Passion to date. The Anti-Defamation League endorsed it. The episode works because it makes a clear distinction between Cartman's anti-Semitism and the show's critique of anti-Semitism. Cartman is the villain. He's the problem. His hatred isn't presented as funny or acceptable. It's presented as dangerous, manipulative, and frighteningly effective when combined with an ignorant crowd. And that's the lesson the episode teaches more powerfully than almost any other South Park episode about race or prejudice. Hate doesn't need a majority of true believers to be dangerous. It just needs one committed fanatic and a crowd that doesn't bother to understand what it's cheering for. The Jewish Daily Forward called this episode perhaps the most biting critique of the Passion to date. And what makes it so effective is that it doesn't just attack Gibson. It attacks the conditions that made Gibson's film dangerous. The credulity of audiences. The historical illiteracy that allowed people to watch a medieval passion play structure and not recognize it as anti-Semitic propaganda. The ease with which spectacle overwhelms critical thinking. Cartman's rally works because the townspeople are entertained. They're excited. They're part of something bigger than themselves. And in that collective excitement, they lose the ability to question what they're actually participating in. If that sounds familiar, it should. Because the dynamic Cartman exploits, the transformation of entertainment into ideology, of spectacle into obedience, is not unique to South Park. It's a pattern that repeats throughout human history. From Nuremberg rallies to social media echo chambers, the mechanism is the same. Get people excited, get them chanting, and they'll follow you anywhere without ever asking where you're taking them. Father Maxey's role in this episode also deserves attention. He's a Catholic priest who tells a Jewish boy that a Christian film is anti-Semitic propaganda. That's a remarkable thing to include. It shows that critiquing religious exploitation isn't the same as critiquing religion itself. Maxey doesn't abandon his faith. He defends it by pointing out that Gibson's film distorts it. And that distinction between faith and its exploitation, between a religion and the people who weaponize it, is one of the most nuanced things South Park has ever articulated. There's another dimension to this episode that gets overlooked: Kyle's crisis of faith. A Jewish child watches a film about the crucifixion and feels personally responsible for something that happened 2,000 years before he was born. That's not rational. Kyle knows it's not rational. But guilt doesn't care about rationality. Guilt operates on a different frequency, especially religious guilt, especially inherited guilt. And Kyle's struggle with it is presented not as ridiculous, but as genuinely painful. Father Maxie's response is the balm Kyle needs. He explains that medieval passion plays were designed to inflame anti-Semitic sentiments. They weren't accurate representations of biblical events. They were propaganda tools. And Gibson's film, however commercially successful, operates in that same tradition. It's not theology. It's spectacle disguised as theology. And the guilt it produces in viewers like Kyle isn't a natural response to Scripture. It's an engineered response to propaganda. That's a sophisticated argument for any show to make. And it's particularly impressive coming from South Park, which is not exactly known for nuanced religious discourse. But the Passion of the Jew earns its nuance by grounding it in character. Kyle's guilt feels real because we've known Kyle for 8 seasons. His Jewish identity has been a consistent part of his character. His rivalry with Cartman has always had anti-Semitic undertones. So when he watches a film that tells him his people killed God, the emotional impact is earned. We understand why this particular child, in this particular town, with this particular bully, would be devastated by this particular film. The episode came out just 5 weeks after The Passion of the Christ hit theaters. And that speed, that willingness to respond to cultural moments in near real time, is one of South Park's greatest strengths. Most shows take months or years to produce an episode. South Park does it in less than a week. And while that speed sometimes leads to episodes that feel rushed or half-formed, in cases like this, it produces something that feels urgent and necessary. A cultural intervention, not a reflection. Let's move to something more recent. Season 17, Episode 3, World War Zimmerman. This one aired on October 9th, 2013, just 3 months after the George Zimmerman verdict that rocked the entire country. The real-world context matters here, and we need to sit with it for a moment, because what happened in the real world is what gives this episode its weight. On February 26, 2012, in Sanford, Florida, George Zimmerman, a 28-year-old neighborhood watch coordinator, shot and killed Trayvon Martin. Trayvon was 17 years old. He was African American. He was walking home from a convenience store, carrying a bag of Skittles and an iced tea. Zimmerman, who had called 911 to report a suspicious person, followed Trayvon despite the dispatcher telling him not to. An altercation occurred. Zimmerman shot Trayvon once in the chest. He was dead before paramedics arrived. Zimmerman claimed self-defense under Florida's Stand Your Ground law. Initially, police didn't even arrest him. It took massive public outcry, protests, and national media attention before charges were filed. The trial became a national spectacle. And on July 13, 2013, after 16 hours of deliberation, a 6-person jury found Zimmerman not guilty of all charges, including second-degree murder and manslaughter. The verdict ignited massive protests across the country and became a defining flashpoint in the national conversation about race, justice, and the value America places on Black lives. It was, in many ways, the precursor to the Black Lives Matter movement that would define the next decade of American politics. Parker and Stone's response came just 3 months later. They created an episode that parodies both the Zimmerman trial and the 2013 film World War Z, starring Brad Pitt. In the film, Pitt plays an everyman who must navigate a global zombie pandemic. In the South Park version, Cartman casts himself as Brad Pitt and imagines Black Americans as the zombies. The episode opens in a way that immediately tells you something is wrong. Cartman is being nice. He's being friendly to Token at school. He's smiling. He's offering compliments. And if you know anything about Cartman, you know that when he's being nice, something terrible is about to happen. When the school counselor, Mr. Mackey, questions him about this uncharacteristic behavior, Cartman drops the mask and reveals his real concern. He believes Token is a ticking time bomb. In Cartman's mind, the Zimmerman verdict will trigger a black uprising, and Token, as the only black student, is the most immediate threat. Cartman has nightmares in which black protesters scale buildings like the zombie hordes in World War Z. He commandeers a passenger plane, discovers a black passenger in the bathroom, and barricades him inside. When the man tries to break out, panic spreads. The plane crashes in the Rocky Mountains, splitting in half, directly mirroring a scene from the film. After surviving the crash, Cartman visits Jimbo's gun store and asks for a rifle to kill Token. Jimbo explains that Colorado law doesn't permit shooting someone unless they're threatening you in your own home. So Cartman and a woman he rescued from the crash travel to Florida, where stand your ground laws are more permissive, to shoot George Zimmerman himself. The idea being that if they eliminate Zimmerman, the verdict will somehow be reversed and the outbreak will be prevented. When they arrive at Zimmerman's house, Cartman is wearing black face paint. Zimmerman shoots him, and officials initially praise Zimmerman for saving them. But then they discover Cartman is actually white, and suddenly the stand your ground defense doesn't work anymore. Zimmerman is tried, found guilty, and executed by electrocution. That reversal is one of the sharpest satirical moments in the entire episode. The stand your ground law, which protected Zimmerman when his victim was black, suddenly fails when his victim turns out to be white. The law is the same. The action is the same. The only variable that changed is the race of the person who got shot. And that's the entire critique in one scene. Back at school, Cartman apologizes to Token, but then immediately tricks him into coming close enough to shoot. He invokes stand your ground. Mr. Mackey tells them both to apologize and let it go, in a line that perfectly captures the condescending way white authority figures dismiss legitimate racial concerns. And Token, angry and frustrated, points out the obvious hypocrisy. The law doesn't apply equally. It never did. The AV Club gave the episode an A-, calling it brutal but meaningful, impactful, and funny. They said it's what satire does when it works. It scorches. IGN rated it 8.7 out of 10. Some critics found the World War Z parody wore out its welcome, and there were questions about whether the episode was too soon given how raw the Zimmerman verdict still was. But the core satirical insight, that American law and American fear are racially coded in ways that most white Americans refuse to acknowledge, lands with devastating precision. There's a moment in this episode that doesn't get talked about enough. Mr. Mackey, the school counselor, tries to resolve the situation between Cartman and Token by telling them both to just let it go. You apologize, he apologizes, and everything will be fine. It's presented as reasonable conflict resolution, but the episode frames it as deeply condescending. Because what Mackey is really saying is, black people should just accept what happened and move on. White anxiety about black anger is more important than black anger about white violence. The system works if everyone just calms down. That's a critique that extends far beyond the Zimmerman case. It applies to every racial incident that gets folded into the news cycle and then forgotten. Every time a community's outrage is met with calls for calm and patience and healing, the episode is saying that those calls, however well-intentioned, serve the interests of the people who aren't hurting. They're a way of managing discomfort rather than addressing injustice. Token's anger in this episode is never presented as irrational. It's never played for laughs. It's the most honest emotion in the room. And the episode respects that honesty in a way that separates it from South Park's more cynical offerings. World War Zimmerman has a genuine moral compass, and that compass points directly at Token. He's the one who sees things clearly, Everyone else is either paranoid, condescending, or complicit. The episode aired just 3 months after the real verdict. Parker and Stone made it in their typical compressed timeline, turning it around in about a week. And while that speed means the episode sometimes leans too heavily on the World War Z structure for its own good, the urgency of the satire gives it a raw power that a more polished version might have sanded away. Now let's talk about one of South Park's sharpest attacks on something different from racism itself. This one goes after the people who think they're fighting racism. Season 21, Episode 3, Holiday Special. This one aired on September 27th, 2017. The timing matters enormously for understanding this episode. In August 2017, just weeks before it aired, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia had shaken the country. White nationalists marched with tiki torches. A counter-protester named Heather Heyer was killed when a car drove into a crowd. The president's response was widely criticized as equivocal, and in the aftermath, cities across America accelerated the removal of Confederate monuments and Columbus statues. The debate about which historical figures deserve public commemoration was suddenly the most urgent cultural conversation in the country. More than 100 U.S. cities had already replaced Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. More were considering it. Into this charged atmosphere, South Park introduced Randy Marsh as the world's most enthusiastic anti-Columbus activist. And the episode immediately signals that its target isn't the removal of statues. It's the people doing the removing and why they're doing it. Randy launches a one-man campaign to cancel Columbus Day. He vandalizes Columbus statues. He tears them down. He defaces them. He calls people who live in Columbus, Ohio, to harass them. He is all in. But then Kyle and Stan confront him with photographs. Multiple photographs spanning years. Photographs of Randy dressed as Christopher Columbus at his wedding, at parties, at various events. Randy has been a Columbus enthusiast for decades. His sudden activism isn't driven by genuine concern for Indigenous peoples. It's driven by fear that someone will find out he used to love Columbus. Randy's response to being exposed is to double down. He sees a commercial for a company called DNA and Me, which is a parody of 23andMe. The commercial features testimonials from white people who discovered trace amounts of DNA from historically oppressed ethnic groups and subsequently identified themselves as victims. Randy decides to take a DNA test, hoping to discover Native American ancestry that will give him credibility in the anti-Columbus movement. But he doesn't trust his actual DNA, so he pays a Native American man to French kiss him, hoping to contaminate his saliva sample with Native American DNA. The Native American man, unexpectedly, falls in love with Randy and begins showing up at his house repeatedly. Randy, who only wanted a transactional exchange, rejects him and kicks him off the property. The DNA results come back. Randy is predominantly Caucasian British, but 2.8% of his DNA is Neanderthal. And in a moment of breathtaking logical gymnastics, Randy reinterprets this result as evidence that his ancestors were raped and eradicated by the ancestors of the DNA company's staff. He finds a way to claim victimhood even when the evidence points in the opposite direction. The episode ends with a compromise. Columbus Day is reinstated, but renamed Indigenous Peoples Day. The students keep their day off. Randy gets to feel virtuous. No genuine structural change occurs. Everyone gets what they want, and nothing actually changes. This episode is brilliant because its target isn't racism. Its target is the performance of anti-racism. Randy doesn't care about Indigenous peoples. He cares about how he's perceived. His activism is a form of narcissism dressed up as social justice. And the episode suggests, with considerable evidence from the real world, that a lot of what passes for racial reckoning in America operates on exactly the same principle. Change the name of the holiday. Tear down the statue. Post the black square on Instagram. And then go home and change nothing about how you actually live. The Native American man is the most telling character in the episode. He's a real person with real feelings who gets used as a prop in Randy's performance. Randy pays him for a kiss, takes what he needs, and discards him. That's the metaphor for the entire episode. Real people with real histories of oppression get used as accessories in other people's redemption narratives. And when they're no longer useful, they get kicked off the lawn. IGN gave this episode an 8.5 out of 10, calling it a return to form with simple, pointed satire. And the beauty of it is that it doesn't let anyone off the hook. It's not saying Columbus was fine. It's not defending colonization. It's saying that the way many people engage with these issues is shallow, self-serving, and ultimately more about their own image than about justice for the people who were actually harmed. And here's where the episode gets really dark, if you think about it. Randy's entire arc is about self-image management disguised as social justice. He tears down statues not because he cares about indigenous peoples, but because he's terrified of being exposed as someone who used to celebrate Columbus. His activism is a preemptive defense mechanism. If he's the loudest voice against Columbus, nobody will look too closely at his own history. That dynamic, that use of activism as armor rather than action, is something that resonated deeply in 2017 and continues to resonate now. How many people post the right things online, use the right language, signal the right values, not because they've done the internal work of confronting their own biases, but because they're afraid of what happens if they don't? How many public demonstrations of anti-racism are motivated not by empathy for the harmed, but by fear of being associated with the harmers? The episode doesn't answer these questions. It just asks them, brutally and specifically, through the most selfish character in South Park, and it trusts you to do the rest. The Neanderthal DNA twist is the episode's final joke, and it's most philosophically rich. When Randy discovers his ancestry is 2.8% Neanderthal and immediately reinterprets this as evidence of ancestral victimhood, the episode is making a point about the infinite flexibility of victimhood narratives. If you're determined enough to see yourself as oppressed, you will always find a way, even if you have to go back tens of thousands of years to do it. Even if the oppressor is Homo sapiens, and the victim is a species that went extinct before recorded history. It's absurd. It's hilarious. And it captures something real about the way identity politics can be stretched to the point of meaninglessness when it's wielded by people who have never actually experienced the oppression they claim to identify with. Now let's widen the lens and look at some of the other episodes where South Park has engaged with racial themes. Because the 9 episodes we've covered in depth are far from the only ones. This show has been dealing with race since its very first season, and the range of its engagement is staggering. From Ethiopian famine, to Mexican immigration, to Middle Eastern stereotypes, to Chinese censorship, South Park has poked at every racial nerve America has. Some of those pokes have been precise and illuminating. Others have been clumsy and harmful. And a few have been both at once. What I want to do now is take you through some of these additional episodes more quickly, not because they're less important, but because they show the breadth of the show's racial catalog. And breadth matters, because South Park's approach to race can't be judged on any single episode. It has to be judged on the pattern, on what the show consistently chooses to say, how it says it, and who it asks to bear the cost of its humor. Starvin' Marvin, Season 1, Episode 8, aired all the way back on November 19th, 1997. It's one of the earliest South Park episodes, and it's about the boys accidentally receiving an Ethiopian child through a charity organization after they donated money expecting to get a free sports watch. The episode is a direct parody of those Sally Struthers commercials from the 1980s and 90s, the ones that showed starving African children while asking for donations. Struthers is depicted in the episode as hoarding the charity's food for herself while publicly begging for more donations. The real Sally Struthers was reportedly a fan of South Park until this episode, which she found offensive. The Ethiopian stereotypes in the episode are broad and uncomfortable. Starvin' Marvin is emaciated, bewildered, and essentially nonverbal for much of the episode. Africa is depicted as a monolithic wasteland of poverty. There's no nuance, no acknowledgement that Africa is a continent of 54 countries with vastly different cultures, economies, and histories. It's just hunger and flies and dusty landscapes. And that's a real limitation of the satire. But the satirical target isn't Ethiopia or its people. It's the Western charity industry that uses images of suffering as emotional leverage while failing to address the root causes of that suffering. The joke isn't that Ethiopian children are starving. The joke is that an obese American celebrity is getting rich off their starvation while pretending to care about it. That's a meaningful distinction, even if the execution doesn't always honor it. The sequel, Starvin' Marvin in Space, which aired in Season 3, took the character into a science fiction setting where the boys try to find the Ethiopians a new planet. Sally Struthers returns, now depicted as Jabba the Hutt, literally consuming while others starve. It's a parody of the white savior narrative, the idea that Western intervention is the solution to problems that Western systems often created. The boys are trying to save the Ethiopians by relocating them to an alien world, which is absurd on its face. But the absurdity mirrors real-world aid strategies that treat displacement and relocation as solutions, rather than addressing the systemic issues of poverty and exploitation. Then there's Goobacks, Season 8, Episode 7, which aired on April 28, 2004. This one takes on immigration, but it does it through the most South Park lens imaginable. Time travel. People from a poverty-stricken future, the year 3045, travel back in time through a newly discovered portal to find work. They're covered in a translucent goo from the portal, and they're willing to accept much lower wages than present-day workers, which creates immediate economic competition and cultural tension. The episode coined one of South Park's most enduring and widely quoted catchphrases. They took our jobs. The line starts out as a coherent protest chant from angry townspeople, but as the episode progresses and the protesters get more agitated and inarticulate, it devolves through several stages of garbled pronunciation until it's completely incomprehensible. It's a brilliant piece of sound design and comedic escalation that captures how anti-immigration rhetoric often starts with a specific economic complaint and degrades into pure incoherent rage. The term goobacks itself is a deliberate play on wetbacks, the slur historically used against Mexican immigrants. The gyo-u comes from the material the time travelers are covered in when they exit the portal. By making the immigrants time travelers instead of Mexicans, the episode creates plausible deniability while making its analogy unmistakable. Everything about the goobacks, their willingness to work for less, their appearance that marks them as outsiders, the economic anxiety they provoke, maps directly onto real-world immigration dynamics. The episode mocks both sides of the immigration debate with characteristic equal opportunity. The anti-immigration crowd is portrayed as idiotic and xenophobic, reduced to their incomprehensible chanting. But the pro-immigration side fares no better. Their proposed solution is to make the future not suck, which involves everyone holding hands and singing in a drum circle while the goobacks keep pouring through the portal. The episode's message, insofar as it has one, is that both extremes are ridiculous, and neither has a workable solution. It holds an 8.3 on IMDb, and remains one of the most referenced South Park episodes in conversations about immigration, partly because They Took Our Jobs has entered the English language as a shorthand for xenophobic economic anxiety. Last of the Mohicans, Season 15, Episode 9, aired on October 12, 2011. In this one, the boys play a sleepover game called Texans vs. Mexicans, where one team has to cross into the other's territory. Butters, playing a Mexican, accidentally ends up in actual Mexico and becomes a beloved folk hero named Mantequilla, which means butter in Spanish, a play on his name. His presence inspires Mexican immigrants to abandon the United States and return home, driven by renewed hope rather than the American dream. The episode is surprisingly humanizing in its treatment of immigration, and it contains one of the sharpest economic observations in the entire series. When the Mexican immigrants all leave, Cartman, who has appointed himself head of border security, initially celebrates. But then, the consequences become clear. Restaurants close because there's no kitchen staff. Construction stops because there are no workers. The town's economy begins to collapse. And Cartman, the show's most xenophobic character, is forced to confront the fact that the people he wanted gone were the people keeping everything running. That's a reality that immigration debates often obscure. The conversation focuses on borders and laws and cultural identity while ignoring the economic fact that immigrant labor is woven into the fabric of American daily life. South Park makes this point not through a lecture, but through the panic on Cartman's face when he realizes what he's done. It's comedy doing the work of economics, and it's remarkably effective. The episode also humanizes the immigrants themselves by suggesting they have legitimate reasons to leave America. The dream of returning home, of building something in their own country, is presented as just as valid as the American dream. And that's a perspective that rarely appears in mainstream media, which tends to treat immigration as a one-directional phenomenon. People come to America because America is better. Last of the Mohicans asks, better for whom? And at what cost? Osama bin Laden. Has Farty Pants, Season 5, Episode 9, aired on November 7th, 2001, less than 2 months after the September 11th attacks. It was one of the first major comedy responses to 9/11, and watching it now, you can feel the rawness of the moment it was made in. The boys are accidentally sent to Afghanistan, where they encounter Afghan children who hate America and view it as an evil empire plotting world domination. The Afghan boys are presented as mirror images of Stan, Kyle, Kenny, and Cartman, but with inverted perspectives. Where the American boys see themselves as the good guys, the Afghan boys see them as the villains. It's a surprisingly sophisticated framing for an episode that otherwise relies heavily on crude stereotypes. Osama bin Laden is depicted speaking gibberish, something like Durka Burka Jihad Allah, and is portrayed as insane and incompetent. Cartman calls the Afghans Jawas and Sand People, referencing Star Wars aliens, which is both a joke about American ignorance and an actual demonstration of it. The Bugs Bunny-style sequence, where Cartman torments bin Laden, is pure slapstick, borrowing from World War II-era Looney Tunes cartoons that similarly mocked enemy leaders through absurdist humor. This episode is the most problematic of the additional entries when it comes to racial stereotypes. Afghanistan is depicted as entirely bombed out and medieval. Afghan people are presented through the crudest possible lens. The language is gibberish. The culture is reduced to terrorism and hatred. And while the episode attempts to show the Afghan children's perspective, the depiction of their homeland and people is so one-dimensional that the empathy feels hollow. The satirical target is supposed to be post-9/11 American hysteria. Cartman's ignorance about the Middle East is meant to be funny because it's so obviously wrong. But the problem is that the episode doesn't provide enough of a counterpoint. There's no character who says, actually, Afghanistan has a rich cultural history, and its people are more than the worst thing that happened on their soil. Without that counterpoint, the stereotypes go unchallenged. And unchallenged stereotypes aren't satire. They're just stereotypes. The episode holds a 7.8 on IMDb and remains one of the more divisive episodes in the show's history. It's worth noting that it aired when the nation was still in shock, still raw with grief and anger. And art made in moments of crisis is almost always messier and less nuanced than art made with the benefit of distance. Parker and Stone were processing the same trauma as everyone else, and the episode reflects that, for better and worse. Banned in China, Season 23, Episode 2, aired on October 2nd, 2019, and this one had real-world consequences that went far beyond anything television usually achieves. Stan's death metal band, Crimson Dawn, is offered a film deal, but a producer informs them that their content must be sanitized for the Chinese market. References to the Dalai Lama are out. Homosexuality is out. Organ transplants, out. Winnie the Pooh, absolutely out, because of the character's resemblance to Chinese President Xi Jinping, which had already been a censored topic in China. Stan faces a choice that mirrors what real Hollywood studios face every day. Compromise your art for access to the world's largest market, or maintain your integrity and lose 1 billion potential viewers. Stan chooses integrity, and the episode suggests, with considerable force, that most of Hollywood makes the opposite choice. Meanwhile, Randy travels to China to expand his marijuana business, gets arrested, and is thrown into what appears to be a forced labor camp. He witnesses executions. He's told to produce marijuana for the state. The subplot is broader and darker than anything the show typically does with Randy, and it grounds the episode's satire in real human suffering. The Chinese government's response was swift and total. South Park was banned from China. The show was scrubbed from streaming platforms. Social media mentions were censored. It was as if the show had never existed in the Chinese market. Parker and Stone issued a mock apology that became one of their most famous public statements. They wrote, with dripping sarcasm, that they too love money more than freedom and democracy. That response crystallized something important about South Park's role in cultural discourse. This is a show that got banned by a nuclear superpower because it told a joke the government didn't like. That's not just comedy, that's power. And the episode is rated 8.6 on IMDb, making it one of the most culturally impactful episodes of the modern era. It proved that a crude cartoon made in a week can shake the foundations of international relations, which is, when you think about it, both impressive and terrifying. And then there's Red Man's Greed, Season 7, Episode 7, which aired on April 30th, 2003. This episode tackles Native American stereotypes through a direct parody of the Indian Removal Act. In a role reversal of historical proportions, Native American casino owners acquire the town of South Park and attempt to force the residents off their land to build a superhighway connecting their casino to Denver. The white residents of South Park are told they have to leave. They protest. They resist. And they're overridden by economic power they can't compete with. The title itself is a play on the concept of manifest destiny and the stereotypical portrayal of Native Americans as noble but doomed. By calling it Red Man's Greed, the episode positions Native Americans as the aggressors, flipping the historical dynamic. The white townspeople become the displaced indigenous population. The casino owners become the colonizers. It's a mirror image of American history, designed to make the audience experience how it feels to have your home taken from you by people with more money and more power. But the execution is where the episode stumbles. The Native American characters are depicted primarily through the lens of greed and cunning. Their casino wealth isn't contextualized within the broader history of how Native American communities came to rely on gaming as an economic lifeline after centuries of dispossession and broken treaties. Without that context, the episode risks reducing complex socioeconomic realities to a simple joke about rich Indians. Critics have argued that the episode reinforces negative stereotypes more than it deconstructs them, and it holds a 7.6 on IMDb, one of the lower ratings for a South Park episode dealing with racial themes. Still, there's something in the reversal that works on a visceral level. White Americans watching the episode experience, for 22 minutes, what it feels like to have their homes and community taken by people who view them as obstacles to progress. That experience, however briefly felt, is a form of empathy that mere education rarely achieves. And if even a fraction of the audience carries that feeling forward, the episode has accomplished something. These additional episodes show the breadth of South Park's engagement with race. From Ethiopian charity parodies to immigration satire to post-9/11 Middle Eastern stereotypes to Chinese censorship, The show has consistently used racial themes as raw material for its comedy. Sometimes it works brilliantly, producing episodes that the NAACP praises and critics call revolutionary. Sometimes it falls flat, relying on the same stereotypes it claims to mock. And sometimes it exists in that uncomfortable middle ground where you can't quite tell whether the show is punching up or punching down. What's fascinating about looking at all of these episodes together is the pattern that emerges. The strongest episodes, the ones that endure and generate meaningful conversation, are the ones that center a perspective from the community being discussed. With apologies to Jesse Jackson, works because Token's frustration is the emotional heart. Here Comes the Neighborhood works because Token's loneliness is palpable. The Passion of the Jew works because Kyle's crisis of faith is genuine. When South Park gives the affected community a real voice with real emotions and real stakes, the satire transcends its medium. The weaker episodes are the ones that treat the affected communities as props. The China Problem never gives its Chinese characters interiority. Osama bin Laden has farty pants, treats Afghanistan as a punchline rather than a place where real people live. Red Man's greed reduces Native Americans to greedy casino operators without exploring why that stereotype exists or who it hurts. The difference isn't about subject matter, it's about empathy. The best South Park episodes about race are the ones where Parker and Stone genuinely care about the people they're depicting. And the worst are the ones where they care only about the joke. There's also something worth noting about how South Park handles immigration specifically. Both Goobacks and Last of the Mohicans refuse to take a clear side. They mock the anti-immigration crowd for their hysteria, and they mock the pro-immigration crowd for their naivete. That both sides' approach is very characteristically South Park, very characteristically libertarian. And depending on your perspective, it's either admirably even-handed or frustratingly non-committal. Because in the real world, immigration debates aren't symmetric. The person fleeing poverty is not in the same position as the person worried about losing their job. Treating both perspectives as equally ridiculous can itself be a form of false equivalence. But then again, that's what South Park does. It treats everything as ridiculous. And in that universal ridicule, there's a kind of democracy. Nobody gets protected. Nobody gets exempted. And while that approach has real limitations, it also has an honesty that more careful, more sensitive shows sometimes lack. South Park will never be accused of pulling punches. And in a media landscape where so much content is designed to avoid offending anyone, there's value in a show that refuses to care about your comfort level. Which brings us to the bigger question, the one that ties all of these episodes together. Why does South Park get away with it? Other shows have been canceled for far less. Roseanne was pulled after a single racist tweet. Comedians like Michael Richards and more recently Shane Gillis have faced career-altering consequences for racial remarks that were arguably less extreme than what South Park broadcasts weekly. Television networks have pulled episodes over concerns about racial sensitivity. Even animated shows aren't immune. Episodes of The Simpsons, Community, and 30 Rock have been retroactively removed from streaming platforms over blackface and racial stereotypes. But South Park, a show that has used the N-word over 40 times in a single episode, depicted an entire town unknowingly goose-stepping to Nazi chants, and created characters based almost entirely on racial stereotypes, has been on the air for more than a quarter century without a single episode being pulled from its catalog. Why? How? What is it about this particular show that gives it immunity that no other show on television seems to possess? Part of the answer is Trey Parker and Matt Stone themselves. Their philosophy has been consistent from the very beginning. In interviews, they've described themselves as equal opportunity offenders. But the phrase doesn't quite capture what they actually do. They don't just offend everyone equally. They target hypocrites specifically. Their formula, if you can reduce it to one, is this: whether you're white, black, gay, straight, male, female. If you're a hypocrite, they're going to nail you to the wall. Parker told Charlie Rose in 2005 that the people screaming on one side of a debate and the people screaming on the other side are the same people, and that it's okay to be someone in the middle, laughing at both of them. Stone told the New York Times that they didn't want anyone coming to the show thinking these guys are going to bash liberals, because it's more fun to rip on liberals since nobody else does it. Not because they think liberals are worse than Republicans. When asked directly about their political leanings, they've given answers that sound almost contradictory. In 2006, they said they hate conservatives, but they really hate liberals. Parker has said he thinks he might be libertarian, but isn't entirely sure. He's registered with the Libertarian Party. Stone has described realizing that people on one side of the political spectrum want to control his life, and then discovering that the people on the other side want to control his life too. In their own words, they're middle ground guys who think extremists on both sides are equally bad, and that most people actually live in the middle ground, but the extremists are the ones with the microphones. That middle ground philosophy is both their greatest asset and their biggest blind spot when it comes to race. It's an asset because it allows them to critique both overt racism and performative anti-racism with equal sharpness. Episodes like With Apologies to Jesse Jackson attack the inadequacy of white guilt. Episodes like Holiday Special attack the performativity of white activism. They don't give either side a pass, but it's a blind spot, because race in America is not a symmetric issue. The person experiencing racism and the person accused of racism are not in equivalent positions. The middle ground between oppression and liberation isn't wisdom, it's complacency. And South Park's insistence on treating both sides as equally absurd can sometimes feel like a way of avoiding the harder question of who actually has power and who doesn't. That said, Parker and Stone have never claimed to be political philosophers. They've never claimed to have answers. They've claimed to have questions. And their best episodes, the ones we've been talking about tonight, are the ones where the questions are sharp enough to cut through the comfortable narratives on all sides. Their position, if you can call it that, is one of radical skepticism toward anyone who claims moral authority. Left or right, progressive or conservative, if you're telling other people how to think or what they're allowed to say, Parker and Stone are going to make fun of you. And that includes people who make fun of other people for a living. They've never claimed to be above criticism themselves. Stone once said that when South Park started, the standards were much higher, and that culture has become crazily more permissive. Whether that permissiveness is a good thing or a bad thing, they leave for the audience to decide. But philosophy only explains part of why they get away with it. The other part is craft. South Park's racial satire works, when it works, because it's built on storytelling rather than shock. Parker has emphasized this point repeatedly. He's said that they can't just make jokes, they have to make stories. And when the racial humor is embedded in a genuine narrative, with characters who have motivations and arcs and emotional stakes, the humor earns its place. Token's frustration in With Apologies to Jesse Jackson isn't just a setup for a punchline. It's a real emotional moment that reveals something true about the limitations of empathy across racial lines. Cartman's Nazi rally in The Passion of the Jew isn't just shock comedy. It's a demonstration of how charisma and spectacle can weaponize ignorance. The speed of production matters too. South Park episodes are made in roughly 6 days, from concept to broadcast. That's practically unheard of in television. And that speed allows Parker and Stone to respond to cultural moments while they're still hot. With Apologies to Jesse Jackson aired just months after the Michael Richards incident. The Passion of the Jew aired 5 weeks after Gibson's film. War Zimmerman aired 3 months after the verdict. This immediacy gives their racial satire an urgency that shows with longer production cycles can't match. By the time most shows get around to commenting on a racial controversy, the public has moved on. South Park comments while the wound is still fresh, and while that can feel reckless, it also makes the satire hit harder. Animation matters too. South Park can depict things that no live-action show could ever get away with. An animated character in a K robe is disturbing, but tolerable. A real actor in a K robe on a major network would likely end the show. The stylized, deliberately crude animation creates a layer of distance between the audience and the content. It signals that what you're watching is a cartoon, a caricature, an exaggeration. And that distance gives the audience permission to engage with ideas they might otherwise reject. There's a psychological term for this. It's called the comedy license. When an audience recognizes that something is a joke, their defensive barriers lower. They become more willing to consider ideas that would trigger resistance in a serious context. South Park exploits this license more aggressively than almost any other show in television history. The crude animation, the profanity, the absurdist plots, all of it signals to the audience that this is not to be taken literally. And within that signal, Parker and Stone smuggle in ideas that are dead serious. Consider the difference between a news anchor saying that white Americans are terrified of black people for irrational reasons, and South Park depicting Cartman dreaming of black Americans as literal zombies from World War Z. The news anchor's statement is factual, but defensive. It invites pushback. The South Park episode makes the same point through absurdity, and the absurdity disarms the audience. You can't argue with a cartoon zombie. You can only laugh at it. And in laughing, you've implicitly acknowledged the truth underneath. But there's a counter-argument to all of this, and it deserves serious consideration. The argument is that South Park, regardless of its intent, normalizes racist language and stereotypes in ways that cause real harm. When millions of viewers watch Cartman use racial slurs and laugh, the show has, in practical terms, made that language more acceptable in the cultural atmosphere. The ironic distance that Parker and Stone rely on doesn't always survive the journey from screen to audience. Not everyone who watches South Park understands or cares about the satirical framework. Some people just hear the slurs and feel validated. Some people watch Cartman and don't see a cautionary tale. They see a hero. This isn't hypothetical. If you've ever been in an online space where South Park quotes are used to justify casual racism, you know the problem is real. People who quote, "They took our jobs," aren't always doing it ironically. People who reference South Park's use of racial slurs aren't always engaging with the satire. They're sometimes just using the show as permission to say things they wanted to say anyway. And the show can't control that. But the question is whether the show bears any responsibility for it. Academic analysis of South Park's racial satire is genuinely divided. Scholar Lindsay Coleman argues that the show's offensive material functions as satirical criticism of real-life racism. The stereotypes aren't endorsements. They're mirrors held up to society's own prejudices. The show creates what some scholars call a Rabelaisian carnival, a space where normal rules are suspended and social hierarchies are inverted. In that carnival space, offensive language becomes a tool for liberation rather than oppression. The slurs aren't weapons. They're props in a theater of the absurd. But other scholars counter that the line between racist satire and racist comedy is thinner than Parker and Stone acknowledge. Because stereotypes appear so frequently in comedy, they argue, repeated exposure to them reinforces them rather than dismantling them. The brain doesn't always distinguish between a stereotype presented ironically and one presented sincerely. Both activate the same neural pathways. Both strengthen the same associations. The show may provide cover for enjoying offensive humor under the guise of intellectual engagement. One particularly sharp critique argues that South Park is fundamentally not subversive, despite its reputation. The argument goes that by mocking everyone equally, by refusing to take a clear moral stance, the show actually reinforces the status quo. It's easy to laugh at both the racist and the anti-racist when you're a white viewer watching from a position of relative safety. The equal opportunity offense philosophy works best for the people who have the least to lose. For someone who actually experiences racism on a daily basis, watching both sides of their reality get equally mocked isn't liberation. It's erasure. There's also a structural critique that cuts deeper. South Park tends to attack individuals and cultural moments rather than systems. It will mock Randy for saying the N-word, but it won't examine the structural racism that makes that word so powerful in the first place. It won't talk about redlining. It won't talk about mass incarceration. It won't talk about the wealth gap between Black and white Americans that persists across generations. It will satirize performative anti-racism, but it won't examine the systemic inequalities that performative anti-racism is responding to, however inadequately. The show's libertarian instincts mean it's always more comfortable mocking people than institutions, more interested in individual hypocrisy than systemic injustice. And there's a reason for that. Systemic critique isn't funny. You can't make a joke about redlining that lands the way a joke about Cartman throwing a rock does. Systems are abstract. People are specific. And comedy, at its core, requires specificity. Parker and Stone gravitate toward individual stories because that's where the comedy lives. But in doing so, they leave the larger structures of racism unexamined. And some critics argue that this selective focus actually serves those structures. By making racism seem like an individual failing rather than a systemic condition, the show lets the system off the hook. This is perhaps the most serious critique of South Park's racial satire. Not that it's offensive, but that it's incomplete. Not that it says too much, but that it leaves out the parts that would complicate its neat both sides framing. The episodes we've covered tonight are brilliant in their dissection of individual attitudes, but they exist in a vacuum where systemic racism is invisible. And in that vacuum, the message becomes, racism is something that individuals do wrong, not something that society is built on, which is comforting for the viewer. But it might not be true. And yet, the NAACP praised with apologies to Jesse Jackson. The Anti-Defamation League endorsed the Passion of the Jew. Wing Han Song wrote a thank you letter. These aren't minor endorsements. When the communities being depicted respond positively to the depiction, it complicates the argument that the show is simply harmful. It suggests that intent does matter, that context does matter, and that the relationship between comedy and harm is more nuanced than either side of the debate typically allows. The truth, if there is one, is probably this. South Park has done both. It has genuinely exposed racism in ways that few other shows have the courage or the platform to attempt. And it has also traded in stereotypes that reinforce the very prejudices it claims to critique. These two things are not mutually exclusive. They exist simultaneously, in the same show, sometimes in the same episode. And the audience's response depends less on the show itself than on what the audience brings to it. If you watch Cartman's Nazi rally in The Passion of the Jew and recognize the satire, you see a devastating critique of how easily hate manipulates the uninformed. If you watch the same scene and just think it's funny to hear German in a cartoon, you've missed the point entirely. The show cannot control which response you have. It can only create the conditions for both. And maybe that's the most honest thing you can say about South Park and race. It's a mirror. It shows you what's already inside you. If you're thoughtful about race, the show gives you material to think with. If you're not, it gives you material to hide behind. And the show itself seems remarkably unconcerned about which outcome you choose. Parker and Stone have always trusted their audience more than most creators do. Whether that trust is admirable or irresponsible depends on your view of what comedy owes to the world. There's a comparison worth making here. In traditional journalism, there's a concept called the Overton window, which describes the range of ideas considered acceptable in mainstream discourse. South Park operates entirely outside that window. It says things that politicians can't say, that journalists won't say. that comedians are increasingly afraid to say. And by doing so, it either expands the window of acceptable discourse in healthy ways, by forcing people to engage with uncomfortable truths, or it poisons it by normalizing language and attitudes that the window was designed to exclude. Both things can be true at the same time, and that's uncomfortable. We want art to be either good or bad, helpful or harmful, progressive or regressive. But South Park refuses to be just one thing. It's progressive and regressive in the same sentence. It's helpful and harmful in the same scene. And that ambiguity is either its greatest strength or its most dangerous quality, depending on who's watching. Comedy Central's role in all of this is worth mentioning too. The network that airs South Park allowed 43 uncensored uses of the N-word in With Apologies to Jesse Jackson. They allowed goose-stepping Nazi rallies. They allowed burning crosses disguised as lowercase t's. But when it came to depicting the Prophet Muhammad, they censored everything. Parker and Stone's episodes 200 and 201, which featured Muhammad, were heavily bleeped and edited by Comedy Central after a website called Revolution Muslim posted threats against the creators, invoking the murder of filmmaker Theo Van Gogh. The discrepancy is telling. Racial content, no matter how extreme, was permitted. Religious content that might provoke violence was censored. The standard wasn't about offense. It was about safety. Comedy Central was willing to offend Black people, Jewish people, Asian people, and everyone else. But it wasn't willing to risk physical harm to its employees. That's a pragmatic decision, not a moral one. And it reveals that the limits of acceptable comedy have less to do with ethics than with consequences. Matt Stone commented on this directly, saying the standards were much higher when they started, and that culture has become crazily more permissive. That observation cuts in multiple directions. It means South Park blazed a trail that other shows have followed. But it also means that the envelope they pushed has been pushed so far that what once felt transgressive now feels almost normal. And the normalization of transgressive racial content is either a sign of progress, meaning we've become more comfortable discussing race openly, or a sign of regression, meaning we've become desensitized to harmful representations. South Park's approach to race has evolved over its 28+ seasons, even if the evolution is subtle. Early episodes like Starvin' Marvin relied more on broad stereotypes with less sophisticated satirical framing. The Ethiopian boy is a prop. The comedy comes from the culture clash. There's empathy, but it's limited. Middle period episodes, like With Apologies to Jesse Jackson, and Here Comes the Neighborhood, developed more nuanced character perspectives. Token becomes more than a token. He becomes a voice. He pushes back. He has feelings that the show respects. The comedy still comes from offensive places, but there's a moral center that the early episodes lacked. Recent episodes like Holiday Special and Banned in China target the meta conversation around race rather than race itself. They're not about racism anymore. They're about how we talk about racism, about who gets to define it, about what counts as genuine engagement versus performance. The satire has become recursive, folding back on itself, examining not just America's racial attitudes, but America's attitudes about its own racial attitudes. As recently as season 28 in 2025, the show was still evolving. In one episode, Cartman turns to what he calls race science to determine who will be the fastest runner. He's determined to recruit Token to his team based solely on his race. And Token's response is direct and deadpan. Just because I'm black does not mean I run fast. It's a simple line, but it captures 28 seasons of evolution. The show started by deploying stereotypes. Now it's deploying characters who refuse to be reduced to them. And in a way, the show's longevity is part of its argument. South Park has survived for over a quarter century, in part because it reflects something real about how Americans relate to race. The discomfort is the point. The offensiveness is the point. The show doesn't create the racial tensions it depicts. It mirrors them. And when you sit with an episode that makes you uncomfortable, the productive question isn't whether the show should have made you uncomfortable. It's why you were comfortable in the first place. Think about that across the arc of American history. In the year 2000, when Chef Goes Nanners aired, the Confederate flag debate was largely a Southern issue. Most of the country could watch that episode and think, well, that's their problem down there. By 2013, when War Zimmerman aired, the Trayvon Martin case had made racial violence a national conversation that nobody could avoid. By 2017, when Holiday Special aired, the debate had shifted again, from whether racism exists to who gets to define it and what counts as fighting it. And by 2019, when Banned in China aired, the conversation had gone global, with American entertainment companies being forced to confront how their pursuit of Chinese markets compromised their stated values on human rights and free expression. South Park tracked all of these shifts in real time, not because Parker and Stone are political scientists, but because they're cultural seismographs. They feel the tremors before most people do. And their willingness to translate those tremors into comedy, however crudely, gives the show a documentary quality that becomes more apparent with distance. You can watch the show's racial episodes in chronological order and see the evolution of American racial discourse reflected back at you, distorted by comedy, but recognizable in its essential shape. There's also something to be said about how the show has handled its own evolution on race. In 2021, South Park quietly changed Token's name to Tolkien, revealing that his name had always been Tolkien, after J.R.R. Tolkien, and that the other characters had simply been mishearing it as Token all along. The kids, confronted with this revelation, have to grapple with the fact that they'd been making assumptions about their black friend's name for years. It's a clever retcon, and it serves as a kind of meta-commentary on the show's own history. Even South Park is willing to reconsider its past choices. Even the show that refuses to apologize for anything found a way to acknowledge that naming your only black character Token might not have been the most thoughtful decision. There's a thought experiment I want to leave you with before we close, and it goes like this. Imagine South Park never existed. Imagine Parker and Stone never made the show. Would American racial discourse be any different? Would there be less racism? More understanding? Better conversations? I honestly don't think so. The attitudes that South Park depicts, the white anxiety, the performative anti-racism, the casual stereotyping, the genuine empathy that occasionally breaks through, all of that existed before the show and would exist without it. South Park didn't teach America to be racist, and it didn't teach America to be anti-racist. It taught America what it already looked like, reflected through a funhouse mirror that distorts the proportions but preserves the essential shape. And that's one more thing worth saying about South Park and race before we close, and it might be the most important thing. South Park doesn't create the attitudes it depicts. Nobody watches South Park and develops racial anxiety they didn't already have. Nobody watches Cartman's Nazi rally and decides anti-Semitism is a good idea. The show reflects what's already there. It holds up a funhouse mirror to American racial attitudes and shows you how absurd they look when stretched to their extremes. And the reason that mirror works, the reason people keep watching and keep talking about these episodes years after they air, is that the reflection is recognizable. We see ourselves in Randy's desperate need for absolution. We see our communities in the townspeople who goose-step without knowing what they're chanting. We see our own limitations in Stan's inability to understand Token's experience. These characters aren't strangers. They're us. Exaggerated, distorted, crude, but unmistakably us. And humor, specifically this kind of humor, the kind that makes you laugh at something you know you probably shouldn't, serves a function that more serious art sometimes can't. It bypasses your defenses. When you watch a documentary about racism, you can maintain an emotional distance. You can think, that's them, not me. But when you laugh at Cartman, and then realize that the thing Cartman said is something you've thought yourself in a less extreme form, the distance collapses. The humor gets inside you before your defenses can stop it. And once it's inside you, it does its work. That's what the best satire has always done. From Jonathan Swift to Mark Twain to Richard Pryor to Chris Rock. It uses laughter as a Trojan horse to smuggle truth past the walls of comfortable ignorance. South Park is part of that tradition, an unlikely, crude, often problematic part of it, but a part of it nonetheless. So where does that leave us? After 2 hours of going through South Park's most racially charged episodes, what do we actually know? We know that this show, for all its crude animation and toilet humor, has produced some of the most sophisticated satire about race in American media history. We know that Token's line about Jesse Jackson not being the emperor of black people says more about the state of racial reconciliation in America than most hour-long dramas have managed in their entire runs. We know that the image of a town unknowingly goose-stepping to Nazi chants is both hilarious and deeply unsettling, and that the distance between those two reactions is exactly where satire lives. We know that South Park has gotten it wrong sometimes. That episodes like The China Problem and Osama bin Laden has farty pants rely too heavily on the stereotypes they claim to satirize. That the show's libertarian instincts sometimes blind it to the systemic dimensions of racism. That animation provides cover for content that would be unacceptable in any other format. But we also know that the NAACP doesn't praise just anyone. That Wing Han Song doesn't write thank you letters to shows that mock her. That an episode using the N-word 43 times can be educational rather than harmful if the writing is sharp enough and the intent is genuine enough. South Park is not a moral authority on race. It never claimed to be. It never wanted to be. It's a cartoon made by two guys from Colorado who met in college, bonded over Monty Python and Terry Gilliam, and discovered they shared a deep skepticism of anyone who tells other people what to think. They're not philosophers. They're not activists. They're not allies, in the contemporary sense. They're comedians who believe that nothing is sacred, that everything is fair game, and that the moment you tell them they can't say something, they'll say it twice as loud. But within that framework, deliberately limited as it is, they've managed to create something remarkable. A body of work that forces Americans to look at their own racial anxieties, hypocrisies, and blind spots, wrapped in a package crude enough that people actually watch it, and actually think about it, and actually talk about it, with each other, at work, online, in classrooms, in living rooms, in exactly the kinds of spaces where conversations about race usually die of politeness. And if you've made it this far, if you're still here, still listening, still thinking about these episodes and what they mean, then something has happened. Something quiet. You've spent 2 hours thinking about race through the lens of a cartoon that most people dismiss as vulgar and juvenile. And the fact that you're still thinking, the fact that these episodes are sitting in your mind and you can't quite shake them, means the show did what it set out to do. It made you think. It made you uncomfortable. And it refused to give you an easy answer. That's what satire does when it works. It doesn't tell you what to think. It strips away the comfortable narratives you've built for yourself and forces you to decide what you actually believe. It takes the things you thought you knew, turns them inside out, and shows you the seams. South Park has been doing that with race for over 28 years. And whether you think that's brave or irresponsible, whether you think it's art or just provocation, the fact that we're still talking about it says something. Maybe it says that the conversation about race in America is never really finished, that the discomfort never really goes away, that every generation thinks it's going to be the one that finally resolves the tension, and every generation discovers that the tension is woven into the fabric of the country itself, not as a flaw that can be patched, but as a feature that has to be reckoned with, over and over, in each new context, with each new vocabulary, in each new decade. And that sometimes the most honest voice in the room isn't the one that speaks carefully and measures every word. Sometimes it's the one that says the thing nobody else will say, in the crudest possible way, and then dares you to figure out why it made you laugh. So that's it. That's the journey. From Chef Goes Nanners all the way through to Holiday Special and everything in between. 26 seasons of a cartoon that never once stopped poking at the most sensitive nerve in American culture. And I think the reason these episodes stay with us, the reason they keep getting discussed and debated years after they air, is that they capture something true, not something comfortable, not something clean and resolved, but something true. That race in America is messy and contradictory and painful and absurd, all at the same time. And that the only way people can process that mess is through laughter. I keep coming back to Token. Across all of these episodes, across all of these different angles and approaches, it's Token who stays with me the longest. The kid whose name is literally a commentary on his own representation. The kid who tells Stan that Jesse Jackson isn't the emperor of black people. The kid who brings rich families to South Park because he's lonely and ends up lonelier than before. The kid who points out the hypocrisy of stand your ground laws while Cartman is pointing a gun at him. Token is the character through whom South Park does its most honest work on race. Because Token isn't a caricature. He's not a stereotype played for laughs. He's a kid who happens to be the only black kid in a very white town, and the show uses his perspective to ground its wildest satirical flights in something real and human. When Token is angry, the episode is better for it. When Token is absent, the satire often loses its moral center. He's the proof that South Park can do this well when it chooses to, and the reminder that it doesn't always choose to. You know, there's a question I've been turning over in my mind throughout this entire video, and it's this. Does South Park make the conversation about race in America better or worse? After 26 seasons and hundreds of episodes, after all the slurs and stereotypes and satire, has the show done more good than harm? And the honest answer is, I don't know. I genuinely don't. I think it depends on the episode. I think it depends on the viewer. I think it depends on whether you're the kind of person who watches Cartman's Nazi rally and sees a critique of manipulation, or whether you're the kind of person who just thinks it's funny to hear German in a cartoon. The show cannot control which person you are, and maybe it shouldn't try. But I do think this. I think the fact that we're still having this conversation, still debating whether a cartoon from Colorado has something meaningful to say about race, is itself meaningful. Because so many shows don't even try. So many creators look at the minefield of racial discourse and decide it's safer to say nothing. South Park looked at that same minefield and ran straight into it, repeatedly, for over a quarter of a century. And while the explosions haven't always produced insight, and while some of them have caused genuine harm, the willingness to enter the minefield at all is a form of courage that deserves acknowledgement, even from its critics. There's a line from an interview where Trey Parker says something that I think sums up his philosophy better than anything else. He says that the people screaming on one side and the people screaming on the other side are the same people, and that it's okay to be someone in the middle, laughing at both of them. That's not a sophisticated political position. It's not a nuanced theory of racial justice, but it's honest. And in a culture where honesty about race is rarer than it should be, where so much of the discourse is performance and posturing and carefully curated language, there's something refreshing about two guys from Colorado who just say what they think and dare you to deal with it. Whether that's enough is a question I'll leave with you. It's a good one to fall asleep to. Because here's the thing about falling asleep to a video about South Park's most controversial episodes. You're going to dream tonight. And somewhere in those dreams, the things we've talked about will be swimming around, mixing with whatever else your subconscious decides to pull up. And maybe, when you wake up tomorrow, you'll think about race a little differently. Not because a cartoon told you how to think, but because a cartoon made you laugh at something you weren't supposed to laugh at, and the discomfort of that laughter shook something loose. That's what good satire does. It shakes things loose. It doesn't give you answers. It gives you better questions. And the best question South Park has ever asked about race is the simplest one. Why did that make you laugh? If you can answer that honestly, really honestly, without flinching, without deflecting, without hiding behind ironic distance or intellectual frameworks, you know more about yourself than most people ever will. You know where your assumptions live. You know what you're comfortable with and what makes you squirm. You know the difference between laughing at something because it's absurd and laughing at it because it confirms something you secretly believe. And that knowledge, uncomfortable as it is the beginning of something, not a solution, not an answer, but a beginning. A crack in the wall of comfortable ignorance through which a little bit of light can enter. South Park didn't build that wall. America did. But South Park, at its best, has spent 26 years throwing rocks at it. And every once in a while, one of those rocks lands exactly where it needs to. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I know it was a long one, but I hope it gave you something to think about, or at the very least, something to listen to while the world gets quiet around you. If you enjoyed this, please do leave a like. And if you haven't subscribed, it really does make a difference. It's free, and it helps us keep making these videos for all of you. Thank you, truly, for being here, for being part of this community. It means more than you know. Good night, everyone. Sleep well. And if you can't sleep, well, that's what the next video is for.